everyone. Thanks very much for joining us this morning for the fourth in this semester's series of TGI FHI, the Franklin Humanities Institute's Friday morning series. This is our final TGI FHI for the semester, and we'll resume next semester when we will have many, I think 9 presentations next semester. And as most of you know, those of you in the room certainly, and some of you at least who are on Zoom, TGI FHI gives you faculty in the humanities, interpretive social sciences and the arts the opportunity to present on their current research to interlocutors in their fields and in related fields, and allows you, the audience, to get to know all our faculty. And there's no agenda or theme indicated in the series, apart from just to present the work that faculty are doing that most excites them at this time. I think that we've got our format sorted out, but please do bear with us as we work to bring our colleagues into our space for the kinds of intimate conversations to which we've become accustomed, and also take advantage of what we've learned over the last year and a half, bringing in an audience from elsewhere as well. And I'm sorry that we can't give you breakfast at this time. We usually do that for TGI FHI. I hope at some point before too long, we'll be able to eat together to break bread. On the website of the Franklin Humanities Institute, you can find recordings of previous TGI FHIs, and also an interview with Erika in which she describes her work. This year, we've included in our roster many new faculty members from this and the last couple of years, with the understanding that it's been harder to meet people recently and to learn about their scholarship, to understand a new wave, but we want to be able to understand a new wave of work in the humanities at Duke that I think is represented by the many new scholars who have come to join us. This morning, I'm very pleased to introduce Erika Weiberg. I was saying to her before you all arrived, it's hard to believe that Erika has been with us at Duke for just over a year and a bit, because she's already contributed so much to the intellectual life of the university, even in this strange context in which we have been working in physical solitude, bolstered by virtual exchange. Erika's been a consistent participant in our Antigone events this semester, our TGI FHIs. She invited us very early on her time here to co-sponsor her invitation to the Theatre of War event with Duke, and has already had a manuscript workshop for her wonderful project, Theatre of the Home Front, Performing Gender and Trauma in Greek Tragedy. And while the field of trauma studies in the 90s centered on Holocaust studies and contemplations of legal and other forms of testimony, the archive, narrative theory, psychoanalysis, over the last 20 years or so, scholars have addressed how those ideas work in different historical and cultural contexts, in which concepts of pain, suffering, and the subject are different and distinct. Different demands were put on the archive that addressed both modern and non-modern concepts of trauma, how one understands the etymological considerations of the term in different traditions, both modern and non-modern contexts, anachronism, the history of an idea, and indeed why Greek tragedy provided the source of so many later theorizations on the subject, whether physical or psychological, shaped through religious notions of stigmata or psychoanalytic ones of castration. Erika's work enters this discussion in profound ways, investigating how tragedy presents women's pain, women on the edge, and women's rage. Well, we may think of Penelope waiting for Odysseus, weaving and unweaving her cloth to stave off suitors as a repetitive manifestation of trauma, of potential and predicted loss. Erika shows us what happens when we shift medium and genre, move into the dramatic form of drama, and specifically of tragedy. And she explores how this functions in the three tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Erika shows how in recent productions, we frequently have a masculinist concern with men's trauma, largely in productions for veterans, for example. And her work turns to the manner in which women are represented as experiencing trauma, sometimes elliptically, sometimes through silence, through shock, through labor, and the sexual dynamics of war. Erika completed her PhD only in 2016, but already has published numerous articles, including The Writing on the Mind, Danaera's Trauma in Sophocles' Trachiniae from 2018, which was the winner of 2 prizes for Best Published Article, one from the Women's Classical Caucus and the other from the Phoenix Editorial Board. The Phoenix is the journal that it was published in. As someone who shares her interest in women's pain, trauma, longing, tragedy, etc., I'm also really delighted by a recent article on pleasure. Even though pleasure and pain, unfortunately, in our worlds, are tightly woven. So a recent article on female pleasure in Ovid draws on the works of French feminist theorists Luce Rigore and Julia Kristeva, as well as Paul Preciado's recent theorization of technologies of female pleasure. And she shows in this article how the problems that female pleasure, she shows the problems that female pleasure poses for a patriarchal discourse on love. Quote, it argues that Ovid's preceptor gestures at female pleasure in his teachings evade and repress it. These moments of rupture, she tells us, when female pleasure materializes only to be defeated, provoke the reader to consider the contradictions inherent in patriarchal ideologies of gender and sexuality, thereby posing a provocative challenge to the dominant social and political order represented most saliently by Augustus and his moral legislation, end quote. Our talk today is titled On Knowing and Not Knowing Trauma in Ancient Greek. Thanks very much for joining us, and over to Erika.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for that generous introduction, as well as everyone who's in the room with me today, physically and on Zoom. I'm so honored to be able to share some of my research with you today. I'd also like to thank the Franklin Humanities Institute for including me in so many of their wonderful events, as well as Sarah Rogers and others at the Institute for organizing this talk. My title today on Knowing and Not Knowing Trauma in Ancient Greek references an essay published by Virginia Woolf on not knowing Greek that demonstrates through its intimate engagement with Greek that she did in fact know Greek, at least as well as anyone could be said to know it. But her essay begins with a paragraph that makes its readers contemplate first how strange and distant ancient Greek culture is, and second, how strange it is that anyone in 1925, let alone 2021, would attempt to know a dead language from a distant time and place. I'm going to read to you this quote. It's vain and foolish to talk of knowing Greek, since in our ignorance, we should be at the bottom of any class of schoolboys. Since we do not know how the words sounded or where precisely we ought to laugh, or how the actors acted. And between this foreign people and ourselves, there's not only difference of race and tongue, but a tremendous breach of tradition. All the more strange then, is it that we should wish to know Greek, try to know Greek, feel forever drawn back to Greek, and be forever making up some notion of the meaning of Greek, though from what incongruous odds and ends, with what slight resemblance to the real meaning of Greek? Who shall say? I begin with this paragraph by Woolf because I want to talk today about a concept that has been central to late 19th and 20th century Anglo-American constructions of the self, but that is also forever being drawn back to ancient Greek, forever making up some notion of the meaning of Greek, to quote Woolf. And that concept is trauma, and in particular, psychological trauma. My goal today is to unpack and nuance two narratives about psychological trauma that emphasize, on the one hand, distance from the past, difference from how, for example, ancient Greeks understood trauma, and on the other, similarity to the past, the idea that trauma is universal. These narratives can be found both in popular culture and in scholarly research on trauma by psychiatrists, trauma theorists, and classicists who study ancient Greek culture. I'll argue in this talk that neither narrative is precisely correct, and that ancient Greek concepts of trauma and modern Anglo-American concepts of trauma are intertwined, so that we continue to act out this paradox that Virginia Woolf has identified again and again, not knowing exactly how the ancient Greeks understood psychological trauma, and yet desiring to make a connection to Greek ideas about trauma from the incongruous odds and ends that we do have. In the first part of my talk, I'm going to walk you through these two narratives about trauma and how they're articulated by trauma researchers and theorists, theater practitioners, and classicists today. In the second part of my talk, I'll ask, did the ancient Greeks have a concept of psychological trauma? What can we know about it? And finally, I'll conclude by talking about how ancient Greek concepts have influenced how we understand trauma today, and how a return to the strangeness of ancient Greek can reveal some of our assumptions about and cultural uses of trauma in the present. So I'm focusing today on two narratives that dominate discussions of psychological trauma, both in popular culture and in scholarly research. Let's start with what I'll call the historicist narrative. According to this line of thought, psychological trauma, as we understand it today, is a distinctly modern phenomenon, a product of the Industrial Revolution and the massive changes that took place at the end of the 19th century. Before the Industrial Revolution, the narrative goes, trauma was understood as a physical injury. And it was only after this historical turning point that people began to understand their experience of the self and the world in terms of psychological trauma. Steph Prax and Lucy Vaughn articulate the idea as follows in their introduction to trauma. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, trauma was understood as a physical injury. It was not until the late 19th century, when the enormous transformations of industrial modernity exposed people to new and hitherto unimagined dangers, that the notion of psychological trauma began to take root. It's certainly the case that the word trauma in English began to take on new meanings at the end of the 19th century. A search for the word in the Oxford English Dictionary reveals that trauma was first recorded in print in 1693, when Blanchard's Physical Dictionary defined it as a wound from an external cause, a physical wound from an external cause. Yet by 1894, trauma had taken on a meaning specific to the emerging fields of psychoanalysis and psychiatry. In psychoanalytic and psychiatric writing, trauma was defined as a psychic injury caused by a shock to consciousness that persists after the initial event has ended. This blossoming of psychiatric discourse on trauma coincided with changes in social life occasioned by the technological changes of the first and second industrial revolutions. And scholars trace the emergence of this idea of psychic injury to the expansion of the railways in the 1860s. The industrialization of travel through the rail system changed how people perceived time and space. It also changed how people perceived injury, as the technological violence that had previously been confined to factories was exposed to travelers in the middle and upper classes. The speed of railway collisions made accidents particularly violent and gruesome to witness. And even survivors of these collisions who had no visible physical injuries reported lasting effects on their nerves. In 1862, the Journal of the British Medical Association published a supplement on the influence of railway traveling on public health that concluded that rail travel could have a concussive effect on the nervous system, while rail accidents could do permanent but invisible damage to the nerves. After he experienced a terribly destructive railway accident in 1865, in which he assisted injured passengers at a bridge derailment, the English writer Charles Dickens reported that he suffered from mental disturbances for months afterward. Quote, "I'm not quite right within, but believe it to be the effect of the railway shaking." Railway shaking, also known as railway spine, had implications not just for medical diagnosis, but also for legal liability, as individuals claimed compensation from private railway companies for lasting effects on their nerves that sometimes emerged sometime after the original incident. This new theory of trauma kicked off contentious debates in both medicine and law about what railway spine was, how to treat it, and whether victims of railway accidents should be compensated for nervous injuries by the railway companies. I won't tell you the full story today of how railway spine was superseded by other terms like nervous shock, hysteria, shell shock, post-traumatic stress disorder, and others over the next 100 years. But scholars like Ruth Lays, Roger Luckhurst, and Alan Young have written about the genealogy of various modern concepts of trauma at length. For our purposes today, the important takeaway from this narrative is the idea that trauma is a distinctly modern phenomenon, shaped by the various technological, legal, and medical concepts that constitute modern life. New technologies in particular, like railways and bombs, expose people to new dangers that have lasting effects on the mind. It's also the case that this idea of psychological trauma, which began to take root at the end of the 19th century, has seen a spectacular rise in interest in the last century. Seth Crafts and Lucy Bond point out that Google's Ngram viewer, which tracks the frequency with which a word is found in print between 1500 and 2019, shows that references to trauma increased over 36,000% between 1880 and 2019. So there's no question that trauma has become more widespread as a concept through which English speakers categorize and represent their experiences. As a result, scholars have argued that we now live in a wound culture, that modernity is understood primarily through the category of trauma, that trauma is constitutive of modernity, and that modern concepts of subjectivity are organized around the concept of trauma. Whether we define modern as post-industrial revolution or post-1990, there's a case to be made for trauma as one of the primary categories through which English speakers today organize and represent their experiences of self and subjectivity. So now I want to turn to the second narrative that exists alongside this idea of psychological trauma as a distinctly modern category. This narrative, which I'll call the universalist narrative, states that what we understand as psychological trauma today is caused by a fear reaction to a shocking event. And since fear is a biological instinct that all people have, psychological trauma is a universal experience that transcends time and place. The ancient historian and Vietnam War veteran Lawrence Tritle, for instance, begins an essay on ravished minds in the ancient world with a quote from the English poet and infantry officer Wilfred Owen, who wrote, quote, "These are men whose minds the dead have ravished." Tritle compares Owen's line with the line from Sophocles' Antigone, a play composed 2,000 years earlier in ancient Athens. Quote, "The strongest mind cannot but break under misfortune's blows. Title concludes, quote, separated in time and place, yet these authors reflect the trauma of war and how the mind can be no less affected than the body. This interest in connecting modern and ancient Greek experiences of trauma was reinvigorated in 1994 by clinical psychiatrist Jonathan Shea, who compared the stories of the Vietnam veterans whom he treated at the VA outpatient clinic to the experiences of Achilles and other Greek heroes in the Iliad. He argued that the Iliad speaks to the experiences of combat and moral injury familiar to modern veterans. As classicist Kelly Wynn has pointed out, Shea's narrative here is selectively universalist. In a recent blog post, she writes, quote, while Shea's work memorializes the experiences of American veterans of the Vietnam War, elevating their trauma to the register of Greek mythology, it relegates Vietnamese people to the margins of history, either victimizing or demonizing them. Wynn's critique of Shea demonstrates one of the major perils of the universalist narrative, which is that it marginalizes experiences that do not correspond to the dominant group's definition of what is traumatic, and demonizes individuals who do not correspond to the dominant group's definition of what is universal. And a lot of my research on women's pain and trauma is related to this line of critique. Nonetheless, there's been a surge of interest in this universalist narrative in recent decades, spurred on by Jonathan Shea's work. In 2009, Brian Dories founded his Theater of War project, whose aim was to raise awareness of veterans' issues, including post-traumatic stress, and the challenges of reintegrating into civilian life by staging readings of Greek tragedy. In the discussions that he facilitates after readings from Sophocles' Ajax and Philoctetes, Dories encourages audience members to share their gut reactions, their personal connections with what they've just heard. In his book, The Theater of War, he reports that one audience member, Major Jeff Hall, responded in the following way to a staged reading of Sophocles' Ajax, quote, my God, that's exactly how I feel. That's exactly how I acted. And it dawned on me that this has been something, an issue, that's been going on for 2,500 years. And the Greeks, this is the way they dealt with it. End quote. Dories engineers the similarity of experience between ancient and modern veteran through word choices in his translations drawn from modern military life, like thousand-yard stare or shell-shocked. He also emphasizes similarity by omitting aspects of the ancient plays that might alienate the modern spectator, like the singing and dancing chorus or the use of masks. The purpose of these performances by and for veterans is not to achieve scholarly or historical accuracy, but rather to emphasize universal experience and thus destigmatize difficult emotions so that modern veterans can confront these emotions and share them with their communities. To drive this point home, Dories ends the discussions at Theater of War project events with a benediction. You are not alone across time. Classicists have also joined the conversation through scholarship that investigates the representation of trauma in ancient Greek and Roman sources and material culture. These two recent edited volumes from 2014 and 2016 exemplify this recent scholarly interest in trauma in classics. Most of this scholarship is specifically about combat trauma, and most of it takes a universalizing approach to the concept of trauma, tracing similarities of experience in ancient narratives and in narratives about combat trauma today. One dissenting voice is that of historian Jason Crawley, who argues against the idea of a universal soldier whose experiences of trauma transcend time and place. In an essay titled Beyond the Universal Soldier, Crawley claims that, quote, historically specific and radically divergent circumstances left the American infantryman critically vulnerable to post-traumatic stress disorder and combat stress injury, while the Athenian hoplite was effectively immunized against the same risk, end quote. Crowley argues that the martial norms and values, social environment, tactical environment, and technological environment of Athenian hoplites made them psychologically resilient to trauma. I don't necessarily agree with this conclusion, but I do take seriously Crowley's call to think about how the Athenian hoplite's environment shaped his experience of trauma. Crowley does not address, however, whether the Athenians had a concept of psychological trauma to which certain values or environments could render them resilient, or whether this concept simply did not exist. So I want to turn to this question next. By looking at evidence from Greek tragedy, medical writing, and historiography, I'll argue that the ancient Greeks, in particular the Athenians in the 5th century and 4th centuries BCE, did have a concept of trauma that both overlaps with and also diverges from how we think about trauma today. The first narrative that we looked at, that trauma is a symptom of modernity, doesn't tell the whole story, as it doesn't recognize how strangely intertwined ancient Greek and modern concepts of trauma are. But the universalist narrative that emphasizes similarity across time and space smooths over the differences between ancient and modern experience, the strangeness of Greek, with which we started, and it risks marginalizing and silencing the experiences and voices of individuals, both in antiquity and today, who diverge from what is considered universal or what is considered the norm. So now I'm going to turn to this basic question, which is nonetheless not at all easy to answer. Did the ancient Greeks have a concept of psychological trauma? And if so, what was it? What can we know about it? As we've already seen, the English word trauma comes from an ancient Greek word, trauma. But we can't use this linguistic borrowing as evidence that the Greeks had a concept of psychological trauma that we borrowed from them along with the word itself. In fact, all of the uses of the word trauma in ancient Greek refer to physical wounds, bodily wounds. So the word in ancient Greek was used similarly to how the word was used in English before the end of the 19th century. If we really want to know the answer to this question about psychological trauma, we need to look beyond the single word to a constellation of Greek words that are used to describe responses to terrifying, often violent situations. The Athenians in the 5th century BCE developed a genre of dramatic art that staged responses to a variety of horrific, violent events experienced by individuals and their communities. And that genre is Greek tragedy. Before we dive into some examples from tragedy, I want to address one of the major challenges I've confronted when trying to answer this question. What we mean by trauma today is constantly being contested and changing shape. And what's more, both clinical and theoretical research on trauma has recently emphasized the diverse range of responses that people have to terrifying events. Part of my research on trauma in tragedy has involved unpacking the diverse forms that psychological trauma can take, both in the past and now. Trauma is not always the consequence of a single shocking event, like a railway accident or a violent assault. People can develop traumatic responses to chronic conditions of oppression, for example. But for the purposes of this talk, I want to focus on one form that psychological trauma is thought to take today, the most well-known form in popular culture. And that is the idea of trauma as an emotional shock from a terrifying event that continues to affect a person's mind, sometimes long after the event has occurred. So let me revise my question. Did the Greeks represent psychological or emotional shock in tragedy? And to answer that question, I want to look at a different cluster of words, in particular, a different word for wound in Greek. This word is plege, and like trauma, it can be used of physical wounds. But it can also be used of psychological or emotional wounds. A scene from Aeschylus's play, The Humanities, which was first performed in 458 BCE in Athens, demonstrates some of the complexities of this word for wound. At the beginning of the play, Clytemnestra's ghost unexpectedly appears on stage and points at the wounds on her ghostly body, which were made by her son when he killed her in revenge for the murder of his father. Her ghost appears on stage to awaken the Furies, these divine embodiments of her rage that you see in this image of the scene from a later Apuleian vase. Clytemnestra has sent the Furies to persecute her son for killing her, but the god Apollo has put them to sleep to protect Orestes from the madness with which they threatened him. Enraged that they are sleeping on the job, Clytemnestra attempts to rouse them from their dreams by pointing at the spectacle of her wounded body. "See these wounds in your heart," she says. So the plagas, the wounds here, are physical. She can point at the marks that they've made on her body. But they're also emotional and transferable, as she demonstrates when she demands that the Furies see them in their hearts. Even after death, Clytemnestra feels the pain of these wounds, and she wants the Furies to transmit the persistent memory of that pain to her son Orestes, so that he can feel it too. There are familiar elements here, but there are also unfamiliar ones. Like the contemporary notion of trauma, the word plagas describes both the blows struck during an attack and the lasting psychological wounds created by these blows. Yet the appearance of these wounds on a ghost departs from modern representations of trauma, as do the presence of these divine embodiments of Clytemnestra's rage, who haunt her son with the memory of what he has done. In addition to this word, plague, which can refer to both physical and psychological wounds, or the blows themselves, Greek tragedy also frequently uses a cluster of words that are formed from plague, wound or blow, and the accompanying verb kleso, which means to wound or strike, with a prefix attached. And these are the words ekplexus and ekplesomai. The prefix ek means out of, and so a very literal rendering of the word ekplesomai would be I'm struck out of myself, or out of my senses, or out of my mind. Ekplexus, the noun, is then the experience of being struck out of oneself, or one's senses, or one's mind. So we're going to look at some examples of the usage of this word in Greek tragedy. After witnessing or perpetrating an atrocity, many tragic characters say that they are struck out of their mind or in shock. Take, for instance, the response of the hero Heracles in Euripides' play Heracles, immediately after he recovers from an episode of madness and sees before him the bodies of his children and wife whom he has murdered without his knowledge. So he says, I am in shock, ek toi peplegmai. Where am I in my helplessness? Hey, who of my friends near or far can cure me of my ignorance? For I do not recognize with clarity anything that I'm used to. Heracles feels helpless in the face of the atrocity before him. He fails to recognize what should be most familiar to him, his own family and his own past actions. He learns only after the fact that he has murdered his own family members. The word ekpeplegmai, that perfect tense of ekpleso, which I've translated I am in shock, has that root meaning of being struck out of one's mind or senses in the past, which then continues into the present. That's the sense of the perfect tense. So thus this rendering, I am in shock. The implication is that this event has so overwhelmed his mind that Heracles' understanding and perception, including his sense of self, have been shattered. The passage anticipates certain modern concepts of trauma, describing a long-lasting psychological response to an event so extreme that it disrupts one's immediate understanding of time and space, one's sense of self, and one's connections with others. Even characters in tragedy who learn about horrific losses secondhand can have this response of shock. In Aeschylus's play Persians, the Persian queen Atassa learns from a messenger that the Persian army, led by her son Xerxes, has been defeated, and tens of thousands of Persians have died. After an extended silence, she tells the messenger that she is in such shock at the news that she cannot speak. I've been quiet for a long time in my misery, shocked by misfortune. For this catastrophe is so excessive that I can neither speak nor ask about what happened. The extreme and shocking nature of the Persians' defeat disarms Atassa's normal responses to a report of misfortune, to speak, to ask questions. Later in the play, she explains that fear has overwhelmed her senses, using the noun ekplexis. For now, in my case, everything seems full of fear, and before my eyes appear the hostilities of gods, and in my ears a loud noise rings that does not heal. Such is the shock of misfortune that terrifies my mind. Although Atassa did not witness the army's defeat directly, her senses go into overdrive as if she had. She sees threats, she hears loud noises. These terrifying sounds, she says, do not heal, but rather the opposite, they hurt. The news provokes pain and feelings of extreme helplessness and fear. The repetition of the prefix ek in the phrase ekplexis ekphabe phrenas, the shock terrifies my mind, emphasizes the intense quality of these emotions as they overwhelm her senses. Like the example from Heracles, these two examples from the Persians anticipate the modern concept of psychological shock after a belated recognition of a past traumatic event. So far, the examples I've given describe characters' reactions after they recognize that they have perpetrated extreme violence, in Heracles' case, and after news of a shocking loss, in Atassa's case. Both of these past events overwhelm the mind with feelings of fear and helplessness, with an experience of psychological shock. But does tragedy indicate that these feelings of fear and helplessness can persist even long after the shocking event is past, as is often a part of the modern formulation of the concept of psychological trauma? To answer this question, I want to look at a passage from another tragedy, Sophocles' Women of Trachis. This play is about a different wife of the hero Heracles, Deianira, who opens the play with a monologue about an incident from long ago in her past that continues to affect her in the dramatic present. As a girl, Deianira says, while still living in her father's house, she experienced, quote, the most painful fear of marriage that any Aetolian girl had ever experienced. Her suitor was the terrifying river god Achelous, who appeared in 3 different forms to ask her father for her hand in marriage: as a bull, as a snake, and as a man with an ox-like face with water streaming out of his beard. You can see a vase painter's attempt to render Achelous as an ox-man hybrid in this image. She prays that she will die before she is forced to marry him. But the hero Heracles arrives and battles Achelous for Deianira. Although she also has no choice in this husband, he is at least relatively normal looking. Here's how Deianira describes her experience of watching the battle between Heracles and the monstrous Achelous. As for the manner of their struggles, I could not describe them, for I do not know them. Whoever was sitting unafraid of the sight could tell this story instead. For I was sitting shocked from fear that my beauty would win me pain at some point. Deianira was so afraid of the outcome of this battle that she could not watch what happened. Even many years after the event has passed, she is still affected by it, unable to tell the story of what happened. She ascribes this lack of knowledge to being shocked from fear, just as Atassa and Heracles had been in the passages we looked at earlier. Yet Deianira's example demonstrates clearly how past events can continue to affect individuals even many years afterwards. The indefinite particle pote in this passage, which I've translated as at some point, refers in its immediate context to the outcome of the battle. but it also suggests that Deianira's fear is ongoing, even in the dramatic present. She is still expecting the pain that she had so feared in this moment, and her opening monologue attests to the constant fear that has marked her life as a married woman. Now, you might be thinking, the situations that tragedy is staging are way more extreme than the situations that most people encounter in their lives. How common is it for someone to be forced to marry a river god who looks like a hybrid between an ox and a man with water for a beard? And if that's what you're thinking, you'd be right. Tragedy stages heroes, kings, queens, and their communities grappling with the most extreme violence and fear and loss and grief imaginable. This is not a theater that strives for the realistic portrayal of everyday life. It's a theater of emotion in the extreme. Yet from tragedy's staging of emotion in the extreme, I think, we can learn something about how the Athenians conceived of emotional responses to more ordinary traumatic events, like sexual violence or combat, which provoke no less fear than the extraordinary scenarios imagined in tragedy. So let's broaden our lens and look at a different genre, historiography. The Athenian historian Thucydides, who lived and wrote in the last half of the 5th century BCE, frequently uses the language of psychological shock, the same word ekplexis or sometimes kataplexis, to explain the responses of individuals, of armies, and of larger communities during the Peloponnesian War. Here's an example from his account of the Spartans' response to their unexpected defeat at Pylos and Specteria. And the many reversals of fortune that had happened in rapid succession and beyond reason gave the Spartans the greatest shock, ekplexin megisin, and they feared that at some point, some disaster, like that on the island, would happen to them again. Because of this, they did not dare to go to battle, and thought that everything that they set in motion would fail, because they had lost all confidence in themselves, being previously unaccustomed to misfortune. The Spartans could not make sense of the defeat in the moment. It seemed to them beyond reason, as Thucydides tells us. The shock of the loss also prompts long-lasting fear that another disaster like the one they had just experienced would happen to them again. This fear of future misfortune is similar to Deianira's statement in Women of Trachis, that she was shocked by fear that her beauty would win her pain at some point, patet. Again, the same word is used here. The Spartans' shock at their loss has long-lasting psychological effects. They lose confidence in their abilities and are in a state of constant fear that something bad will happen to them again. I don't have time today to give you more examples from Thucydides, although there are many to choose from. These examples show us that the idea of psychological shock as a response to disaster also made sense in the context of Thucydides' descriptions of actual losses that the Athenians and Spartans had experienced due to war and sickness. And from the mythological register of tragedy to the historiographical inquiry of Thucydides, the use of ekplexis prefigures late 19th and 20th century accounts of psychological trauma, whether it is called railway spine or shell shock. There's one last genre that I'd like to talk about today, and that is medical writing. The Hippocratic Corpus is a collection of Greek writing on various aspects of medicine, from the ethics of medical practice to how to describe and treat different illnesses. These texts were written by various medical practitioners in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE and collected under the name of the early physician Hippocrates. Despite an interest in mental health, which Chiara Tumiger has outlined in her 2017 book, these texts do not explore mental disorder or disease as diagnoses. The Hippocratic authors, Tumiger claims, think of insanity not as a disease or a problem per se, but within a continuum in which mental health can have degrees and variations, and is one sign among many within overall physiological health. So it's a modern assumption about psychological trauma that would lead me to look in Greek medical texts for evidence of a Greek concept of trauma in the first place. Whereas modern American culture has constructed psychological trauma through medical diagnoses and psychiatric medical treatment, The Greeks did not think of the psychological shock that they represented in tragedy and in historiography, among other sources, as a psychological condition or illness that could have a distinct diagnosis. In fact, even in tragedy, this experience of extreme fear and shock is not represented as an illness, although tragedy often depicts mania or insanity with the language of disease. Classical Greek medical treatises also never represent psychological shock as a distinct disease that could be diagnosed and treated. The only passage that I could find that mentions a shocked mind in the Hippocratic corpus represents it as but one symptom of a uterine disease that affects a woman's whole body. The evidence of the Hippocratic corpus, or rather absence of evidence of a medical discourse on psychological trauma, demonstrates that even though there are some parallels to modern ideas about psychological trauma in Greek tragedy and historiography, there are also considerable differences that illuminate our own assumptions about psychological trauma today. Okay, so I'm going to conclude now by returning to this tension about between these two narratives about trauma that I started with. How does the analysis that I've offered of the language of shock in Greek tragedy, historiography, and medicine change how we understand each of these narratives? I'll start with the second narrative, the universalizing idea that modern and ancient concepts of trauma are similar, if not the same, that the Greeks had a concept of psychological trauma just like we do. On the surface, some of my analysis today seems to support this view. The passages from tragedy and from historiography that we looked at suggest that the Greeks did understand and represent a response of psychological shock after a terrifying event that could have lasting effects on people's minds. Some might say that this similarity is explained by biological mechanisms in the mind that respond to fearful events in similar ways, regardless of cultural and temporal differences. While I'm not going to reject that idea outright, I do want to suggest another possibility that complicates this narrative. At the end of the 19th century, when the word trauma began to be used to describe psychological wounds in English, Sigmund Freud was developing some of his most influential ideas about trauma, including the concept of Nachträglichkeit, or belatedness or afterwardsness, really hard to translate word, which has become central to more recent theories of trauma, especially those of Kathy Caruth, whose work reawakened literary scholars' interest in trauma in the 1990s. Although Freud himself never defines the term, Nachträglichkeit refers to the idea that individuals recognize trauma not in the moment in which it occurs, when the mind is shocked, so shock is central to this idea, when the mind is shocked and overwhelmed by the experience, but after the fact, as the mind recursively returns to the memory of a traumatic event. This concept of a plot of belated recognition imitates the plot pattern of a Greek play, central to Freud's theory of the psyche, Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannus. In this play, Oedipus learns only after the fact that he has murdered his father and married his mother. The twin traumatic events of patricide and incest haunt him and his community in the form of a plague that threatens them many years after these events took place. The play traces Oedipus's gradual recognition of the truth of his past, his belated recognition that he has killed his father and married his mother. Aristotle even calls this moment of recognition on Oedipus's part ekphysis, shock. So tragic shock and the plot of its belated recognition that I've traced in these Greek texts was inscribed in 19th and early 20th century conceptualizations of psychological trauma through Freud's engagement with Greek tragedy. We have a really tangled knot here. What then of the first narrative, that the idea of psychological trauma took root at the end of the 19th century in response to the massive social changes brought on by the Industrial Revolution? The idea that psychological trauma is a distinctly modern preoccupation. I've also touched on several ideas that seem to support this narrative. The tendency to create distinct and diagnosable psychological disorders, such as PTSD, as you see with the DSM here, has no precise equivalent in ancient Greek culture. Likewise, I know of no legal discourses from ancient Athens about compensation owed to individuals suffering from psychic shock, as we saw in the wake of the rise of rail travel and railway accidents at the end of the 19th century. Although classicists who are in the audience, if you know of any, I'd love to know. Ideas about psychological trauma, as we've seen, are the product of a variety of cultural discourses, medical, legal, aesthetic, among many others, and thus they take on different shapes in different times and places. But the history of this modern concept of trauma is also intertwined with the Greek tragic plot and language of trauma in ways that complicate the notion of psychological trauma as a unique symptom of modernity. More work needs to be done in untying the conceptual knot of ancient and modern discourses of psychological trauma. As we do, I think we'll find that modern ideas about trauma have been shaped by certain ancient ideas, but also that the ancient Greeks' concepts of trauma are stranger, more different from ours than they might at first appear. And as we begin to understand the various cultural forces that we used to construct ancient ideas of psychological trauma, that were used to construct ancient ideas of psychological trauma, we'll be able to return to the contemporary ideas better equipped to critique and question them. What would it mean to approach trauma today primarily as a social issue, rather than as a medical one? And what new ideas about trauma in antiquity could we discover if we abandoned the search for similarities and truly attempted to grasp the strangeness of Greek? Thank you very much for your attention today. I'd be very happy to answer any questions.
So much, that was wonderful. The floor is open for questions on Zoom as well as in our room. For those of you who are in the room, for the sake of our Zoom audience, I'd really appreciate it if you could just say who you are before you ask the question. Michael.
Hi, my name is Maiko Lele. I'm a new postdoc at FHI. Thank you so much for your talk. To be honest, I don't know anything about trauma and I don't know anything about ancient Greek. Yet your presentation was really very well organized and I understood it very well, so thank you for that. I guess I really liked how you concluded your talk, talking about how we must think of trauma as a social and maybe cultural specific concept. And I say this because I took a class back in the days during my master's on social cultural psychoanalysis or something like that. And it was about victim trauma in like genocide, in the Rwanda genocides or like natural disasters in Northern Africa. And so I guess I don't have really a question to formulate, but more so like something to point out that, with the migration and different beliefs like religion and different cultures, how we treat trauma or think of trauma or embody trauma is really culturally or socially specific, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I was wondering, because you were looking at ancient Greek, and again, I don't know anything about ancient Greeks, but as this sort of one thing, but then you were mentioning, excerpt with like some Persian stuff. So I was wondering, even within this ancient Greek concept, was there, maybe there's more to this one idea, and depending on where people were, different communities, if they were, I don't know, enslaved, and the fact that they were believing in multiple gods, and I don't know if they believed in reincarnation, but all those kinds of things have it completely dissociated with our Western beliefs or way of being today, right? And so I was wondering if you saw any nuances like that.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. You're absolutely right that I was way oversimplifying when I said the Greeks, right? And I think at one point I said, what I really mean is the Athenians in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, because when we're talking about the ancient Greek world, we're talking about an incredibly diverse set of geographical locations as well as temporal, a big temporal range, right? And so I'm aware of that, but I'm also, kind of constrained in a way by my sources. And I've chosen to kind of look at the 5th and 4th centuries BC in Athens because that happens to be where a lot of our sources are from, the literary sources. And so you're right that I should say not the Greeks, but the Athenians really in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. And even, the play that was about the Persians that's taking place, imagined to be taking place in the Persian court, was written by an Athenian in the 5th century BC, just imagining what that would have been like. And it very much has imposed on it these kind of Greek ideas about what it meant to be Persian. And tells us really a lot more about the Greeks than it does about the Persians. But yeah, I don't want to flatten out how incredibly diverse the ancient world was. And I think what I want to point out is how there are these kind of like almost false similarities between how we think about trauma today and how the Greeks are thinking about it. And in choosing just this one idea of shock, I'm also kind of oversimplifying what is, I think, a much more varied way of thinking about trauma in the ancient world too. And I chose that one because I think it's the one that has the most kind of false similarities with between then and today. But there are these other concepts, like one of the ones that I look at in my book is this idea of labor pain as an emotional pain that women in particular experience. And that idea gets at, also what you were pointing to with diverse embodiments, right? And how that affects how people experience trauma. So yes, I want to embrace that pluralistic vision of, what trauma is, as well as what I mean by ancient Greece. But for the purposes of this talk, I had to really focus down.
I'll take one from Zoom and then come back to you. This is a question from Patricia Rosenmeyer from UNC Classics, who asks, who says, I'm interested in the different words that are associated with plexus. Your example included mind, phrenes, heart, cardia, and the Hippocratic text, nome. While we know that these words are very hard to pin down, do you think the different words almost specifying the imagined locations of the blow, express, there it is, express differences between the kind of shock?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question as well. So you see how in a lot of these different sources, and I think also this is also the case in tragedy, that tragedy doesn't have, it's not always the phrenas that are affected by ecplexus. It's other, the Greeks had all of these different ways of thinking about mind and different locations in the body also that were associated with, the seat of cognition. So the phrenas is thought to be the middle of the body, and other locations are thought to be in the head. And I think that that's a great suggestion. If we think of plege as a blow, maybe the specification of these different areas of the body are meant to represent that in some way. The middle of the body and the liver in particular is one place where characters in tragedy are often struck by sword wounds and by other kinds of blows like that. And so I think that might be the case, that we're, this maybe mind-body dichotomy that is central to modern ways of thinking about trauma, that might be also flattening out a difference between today and then, that the Greeks were really thinking of what I've said is a psychological or emotional experience as an embodied one. And you can see that through these different ways of thinking about the blow to the body that these events imagine. So yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if I answered the question, but I like it.
Can I just maybe take the privilege of the temple moment and sort of extend that a little bit, because in psychoanalytic work also over the last I don't know, 25 years or something, there's been this rise in neuropsychoanalysis. which is exactly sort of looking at this question of whether the mind-body distinction that was important for Freud when he moved away from neurology into the development of psychoanalysis, right? Because in a sense, the argument is anyway that neuroscience wasn't developed enough. And so in a sense, there had to be this distinction between the psychological and the physical. People like Mark Soames now want us to sort of think about these things together, not to be not to do away with psychoanalysis at all, but to sort of say that then we need to understand this relationship between neuroscience and the effects on the psychological life of the body that people respond to it in different sorts of ways. So, I mean, I also had this question, and of course, you know, I mean, I suppose also through psychoanalysis, but in studies of say the Gothic novels, there's all this work on hysteria and you know, coming from the womb, etc. So, I mean, I also had this question about this distinction that seems important to the way you're setting up between body and mind, because it feels as if there is a return to that, for example, in the neuroscientific work, and of course the railway trauma is also an affliction of the nervous system. Right. So.
Yeah, I think that in kind of wanting to trace this larger 19th and 20th century narrative, I got caught a little bit in this dichotomy, which I don't think is necessarily present in the ancient Greek texts. Although I think there is, it's interesting to me that, you know, these examples that I've given are not talking, there isn't any kind of bodily wound that is wrapped up in the emotional wound that's being described in any of those passages that I brought up, except for maybe the Hippocratic one. But in tragedy, I mean, they're really interested in how this recognition of something horrifying that hasn't left a trace on the body necessarily is still perceived by these different organs associated with cognition. And, you know, separating the organs of cognition from other organs is maybe a false way of thinking about it. But that is kind of the distinction that I wanted to make. That there's, you know, we started with this passage from Humanities with Vegas, and that word can do, I don't think you can separate out whether it's a psychological or a physical wound there. But when we get to this ectasis idea, that's where I think, you know, you always see it in the sense of this recognition of a kind of a shocking, terrifying event that doesn't necessarily leave any bodily trace.
Right. Thank you.
I think actually that was my question was, I'm Saskia Zlakowski in Romance Studies, and I thank you so much for this talk and the wonderful references, and your wolf made me think of the wolf son being ill and the idea of the body, and whether or not you were also proposing that in fact there was more of a relationship between the mind and the body in ancient texts than is sometimes recognized. So I think you might have already answered it, but that question definitely came to mind, that you're maybe proposing or exploring.
Yes,
this.
yes. Yeah, and I think you know, that idea has been explored by other classicists as well. So I wouldn't say that I'm like doing anything new in that way. You know, part of, you know, bringing in the Hippocratic texts, those texts in particular show that there is no kind of separate theorization of some idea of psychology that is divorced from the body. And I think what I'm interested in thinking about is, you know, tragic discourses are also different from medical discourses, and you can see how they're exploring that idea differently. Because in tragic discourses, there is sometimes this idea of insanity as a disease of the mind, which you don't get in those medical writings. So there's kind of a different way in which they're they're thinking about these through dramatic performance versus through medical writing. But yeah, I think even in tragedy, I'm interested in that idea that we have these, tragedy is also really embodied, and I didn't really explore that, but this is a performance where you have actors taking on these roles on stage and performing with their bodies this idea of emotional shock, right? And so I think that in that performance, you have this sense that it's not just about something internal, but it's an embodied experience. And also the external-internal dichotomy, I think, is one that tragedy plays with as well. This idea that you have these external forces coming upon our characters. We saw the representation of Clytemnestra's rage in the Arindes embodied on stage. These kind of externalizations, I don't think they would have thought of them that way necessarily, but you have these embodiments of these ideas of shock and of rage and of pain in a way that I think seems really different from how we tend to think about trauma today.
I'll take one from Zoom and then come back to the room. This is from India Nataman at UNC. Thank you for such a great talk. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how ancient, I think this is actually a continuation of this discussion, in fact. If you had any thoughts about how ancient Greek conceptions of the body might inform us as a trauma. That is, how ancient ideas about the body that are different from ours, for example, that male bodies should be impenetrable, while female bodies are leaky and penetrable. I'm thinking of work on the female body in Hippocratic texts by Leslie Dean Jones, Helen King, etc. Might dictate what experiences ancient Greeks found traumatic. Do ancient conceptions of the body, particularly the gendered body, make them consider things traumatic that we don't, or vice versa?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. So tragedy is really interested in this question of gendered pain, both physical and emotional, and it's playing with, a lot of tragedy is playing with how the male body is feminized through pain, whether physical or emotional. So in The Women of Trachis, that play that I talked about before, at the end, after Deianira accidentally sends what she thinks is a love charm to her husband, but in fact it's poison, he finally arrives on stage in utter pain. Just his body is on fire with pain. He can't be touched by other characters. It's this really intense depiction, and it's called a disease as well, of physical pain. And in that moment, he says, I've been turned female in my pain. I cry like a virgin girl. So you have this sense that being rendered vulnerable by physical pain is a traumatic experience, in part because of its associations with femininity. Then another thing that I'm interested in the same play is the way that these kind of social systems, patriarchal systems that create, ordinary environments where women are forced to marry people that they have no desire to marry, as we saw in that passage that I started with, create these kind of chronic conditions of pain and fear for women. So both of those experiences, as well as the experience of being enslaved in war, which gets back to your question earlier, are being explored as gendered experiences of pain and trauma. I don't know if that totally answers the question, but it's kind of a huge topic that I can talk a lot about. But I definitely think that tragedy is interested in exploring this this idea of pain as gendered and what happens when this supposedly unpenetrable male body is depicted as penetrated by pain and by other things. You also have women who are depicted as acting in not properly feminine ways, and the way that affects how they are embodied in their experience of pain. So there's a lot of ways to go with that, but I hope I've touched on some of them with that answer.
Thanks.
Yes, I'm Rich Freeman. I wanted to sort of ask about the body, and we've been talking about the body-mind business, but to come back actually to the mind, and to ask if I was thinking of Heracles coming back into himself in some sense and looking at what he had done without him doing it, right, at some level. Thinking about the notion of belatedness, right, this that you're actually staying outside yourself. And I was wondering to what extent the notion of dissociation, which is really not so much a problem with body and mind, but the mind with itself, and particularly, you know, this alienation towards yourself, of standing outside yourself, and thinking, rather than thinking of it as I mean, the idea of physicality, and of course it ties into our medicalization of trauma and all of that, but at a more discursive level, if you think or you see in any of this material what we would think of as dissociative aspects of the shock, right, of seeing yourself outside yourself, or not being able to come to terms with what you're seeing.
Yes, yeah, I think that is present in this concept of ektasis, ekplasomai, what's
Right,
going on there,
struck
this idea of,
out.
yeah, exactly, being struck out of your mind. The ek there kind of implies that you're saying a little bit about dissociation, that, you know, in these shocking moments, you aren't able to perceive even what has happened. You don't, you know, he says, I need help here in my ignorance. I can't even understand what is right in front of my eyes. And so I think there is that kind of, you know, idea of, I don't know, you know, it's hard to say, is it exactly how dissociation has been theorized today?
Sure.
Maybe not, but there is a sense of, you know, it brings you out of your ability to perceive. And you saw that with Atasa as well, when she hears about the report. You know, she says, well, I can't even speak and I can't ask questions, and, you know, I'm overwhelmed by my perceptions and unable to comprehend them, right? So yeah, I think that that's a huge part of that experience of being struck out of yourself, whether your body or, you know, it doesn't specify, the act doesn't specify from what, right? So that you're being struck
yourself
out.
or your body.
Yeah, exactly.
Just sort of to tag on to this conversation, one more, maybe more specific question about the Greek context.
Please identify who you are for the sake of the.
Yes, sorry, I'm
Yes.
Kate Morgan. I'm also a professor in the classical studies department, though I'm an archaeologist and not particularly well versed in Erika's area of expertise. I was just wondering if the word ekplasis usually occurs with the sort of helper word by fear, and we saw it several times that you were struck out by fear, but is it something that in general is seen by doing, you know, is undertaken by something physical, like usually you're struck out by a stone or a sword, or what are the other contexts in which this word occurs? And is this sort of by fear like a specific and maybe more rare, or
I would say that fear is the most common association with it. And actually, I think that they had to specify that it was from fear, because you can also be struck out of yourself by other experiences, although it's far more rare. But you can be ekplasomai by extreme joy. And you see that, I think there's only 2 examples of that I've ever found, but that's a possibility. And I think that the striking out has more to do with like the extremity of it. It's so shocking that there is this reaction of you can't quite understand it in the moment, right? And so you can have that reaction in a lot of different contexts, but the most common one, and this might be because of what tragedy is interested in, which is fear. The most common one in tragedy is fear. There's some, you know, other passages by other writers. Like there's another passage from Aristotle that talks about the emotions, or he's kind of categorizing the emotions in his rhetoric, and he talks about how the difference between phobos and ekplasis. Phobos is the word for fear, ekplasis is this word we've been talking about. is that ekplexis is so extreme that when you feel ekplexis, you can't feel anything else. Because you can't feel pity for someone else. Because it's such an extreme feeling, right? That it's only that, it's this extreme fear that you feel. So I think I would say it's most often associated with fear, but it's not only associated with fear.
But it's often associated with emotion more so than a physical
Yes.
cause.
Yeah, it's used in these discussions of emotions as if it itself is an emotion.
There's a question, there are lots of questions over here. There's a question from Leo Trotz-Liboff, who says, thanks so much for the talk. Does Thucydides' use of tragic narrative techniques in his historiography add another knot in mediating everyday shock through the dramatic genre?
Yes, absolutely. So Thucydides' history is using a lot of these. The larger work is following a kind of tragic plot, and I would say it's a tragic plot of belated recognition for the Athenians that they've overextended themselves in their empire and suffer this kind of belated understanding that they've done so in Sicily in particular. And in the Sicilian narrative, in Sicily is where you get the most examples of this use of ekplexis and also kataplexis, which is, the same root with a different prefix, meaning, I think, pretty much the same thing. And so I do think that Thucydides as well, this is kind of creating another conceptual knot, is using tragic language and tragic ideas about shock to talk about the fall and belated recognition of that past mistake by the city of Athens. So you think about the city of Athens as a protagonist in this tragedy, right? So absolutely, that's part of it. And I think that's why you see, this is somewhat unusual to Thucydides, this how much this use of the word for shock is present in the history. So other historiographers don't use the word so often. So I think that's part of the reason why.
Thanks. There's a question from Tori Lee, which I think is very, very interesting here, and speaks to the theatre of war group, for example. And she says, hi Erika, I have a more practical question, I guess. I really love how you problematize these two narratives about trauma being either universal or very culturally specific. How do you think this should affect our outreach efforts as classicists when it comes to programs like Theatre of War, which I know has reached a lot of people outside academia, or programs that read ancient texts with veterans in the US? I might also add something that on sort of the other end of the age spectrum, perhaps, with children. There's sort of the Percy Jackson type wave. I mean, it feels so much like it's sort of the moment of classics.
Yes.
In so many ways. And so
Yes.
how do you, I think that the question is, how do you garner that energy without sort of problematizing it the way that you have?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot because I think that doing that kind of outreach is really important. I also think that we need to be aware of the kind of narratives that we're engaging in when we're doing it. So like Percy Jackson, the example that you've given, I mean, that series, which I know attracts a lot of children's interest in Greek mythology, it also kind of puts forward this idea of Western civilization as somehow superior, I think, in ways that are really insidious. And I think in some ways it's our job as classicists to kind of nuance that and kind of bring attention to that. I don't think that Theatre of War is insidious in the same way. I really do think that project is trying to be more inclusive actually than it was at its beginning, and it's become increasingly so. So what started out as this project that was really meant for, performed for veteran audiences only in the Pentagon, it's really become a much bigger project than that, and one that has tried to be more inclusive by doing things like, including women veterans as part of the conversation, including wives of veterans, as well as turning to other populations and thinking about the ways that we can use tragedy to talk about those experiences. And I think I said in my talk, the purpose of the Theater of War Project is not this kind of historicizing scholarly project, and I think that's fine and good. But I also think that there's ways that maybe in moderating discussion, because Theater of War Project is all about the discussion. That's really the important part. You can kind of bring attention to. I don't think it always has to be a universalizing narrative that can be used in this way of talking about traumatic experience. And in fact, at some Theater of War events, sometimes people bring up the fact that, well, in assuming this kind of universalizing narrative, there are people who are left out of the equation here, right? That these texts tend to be about male heroes' experiences, and when they're about women, they're often really negative narratives, right? And these ancient civilizations were predicated on slavery, and what does it mean to be using these to create a kind of inclusive idea about pain, right? And sharing of emotions. And I think that that's where the discussion can be so useful, just providing a little bit of historical context there, which can kind of complicate the universalizing narrative, but maybe in a good way. So that would be my answer.
I remember this conversation coming up actually after one of the Antigone and Ferguson Zoom productions, exactly this actually. How does one, what's the efficacy of to some extent, obviously, theatre is going to be a product of the moment of production, right? But also then it's a constant problem for theatre in a sense, right. or an opportunity for theatre. But it was exactly this that was being addressed. How does one understand the question in relation to this? Thank you.
Right.
Thanks very much. There's a question from Suzanne Lynch at UCD. Thanks for a great talk. The example you gave about Clytemnestra's ghost wanting to transfer her physical wounds onto her son in the form of psychological wounds is fascinating. I completely agree. Do we know anything more about how the Athenians imagined such a transfer and transformation of trauma from one person to another, from physical to psychological wounds, how that occurred, and have you come across other examples?
Yeah, I think that this is one of the things that tragedy is really interested in, this idea of the transfer of wounds from generation to generation. And you see that articulated in the Oresteia in particular. You have these kind of transgenerational wounds that are passed on, and the language of the wound is present throughout the Oresteia trilogy. So it's that moment in the Humanities is especially striking to me, but there's in the Agamemnon, the chorus talks about uses this language of wounds as well to talk about Troy. And I think there's this larger sense, and I didn't really go here, but a lot of more recently people have been thinking about cultural trauma as a phenomenon, and I think that the Greeks are also interested in this idea. Both cultural trauma and this kind of transgenerational transmission of trauma within a family. And yeah, so I think that's really a tragic preoccupation that you see in especially in the Oresteia, but also in other places. And I need to look more at that language of play gay and see if that occurs elsewhere. But often it's framed more in terms of this kind of like religious idea of ate, like divine madness that plagues a family generation after generation. And so that's another kind of difference between, I think, how we often conceptualize of these ideas of how wounds are transferred, which is often today talked about in this kind of epigenetic way. But yeah, different ways of thinking about it then.
Thanks so much. There's a question from Ben Ellen Took, and this is, it's a huge question. So take whatever part. And you'll see what I mean. Here is how you consider a history of trauma in the West between the 1st century BCE and the late 19th century. So basically, that huge period that you didn't discuss in the West. Is your hunch that emotional trauma was more dormant as a concept during this time, or that it took its bearings from different sources, e.g. Judeo-Christian rather than ancient Greek? Also curious how you think about mapping a broader, more global history of trauma, parallel, non-interactive strains of trauma. So I mean, just take whatever part.
Yeah, I find that a little hard to answer, not least because I'm not really a specialist in that period. But I do think that, this kind of methodology that I've laid out could be used to study any of those periods. But I would say that you really have to go about it thinking about the different, the cultural specificities of it, the social specificity of it in those different periods. But I will say that, there have been examples from within that large range that have been really central to theories about trauma today. I'm thinking of Kathy Carut's example from Jerusalem Liberata, Tancred and Florinda, which is really central to how she's thinking about belatedness and the wound as well. And so she sees it there, but that idea of hers has been critiqued a lot more recently as well. So I think that, in all of these periods, people are thinking about, how do these horrifying events, these kind of events that are extraordinary, not because they don't happen frequently to people, but because they seem like they're the most extreme events we experience. How do we make sense of those emotionally, and what are the effects on us long term? So that's a question that I think cultures all over the world in different time periods have thought about. And I think that, the way that I think that ancient Greece is this weird relation with today, and that it's kind of entangled in our discourses of trauma in ways that need to be untangled. But that any culture, Western or not, could be analyzed in this way, kind of trying to think about the different discourses that go into constructing ideas about trauma. I know that's a little bit of an out that I'm taking, but.
Yeah, why don't we wrap up with you had another, Michael, did you also have another one? Okay, yeah, cool. No,
Oh.
Rich, go ahead.
I wanted to, in thinking about the display of trauma and the sort of the enactment of it in drama, but also in literature. I have in the back of my mind this vague memory of Socrates saying that young warriors should be taken to the battlefield and showing all the carnage of battle to get them ready for their future job. And I was wondering to what extent any of this, and I was thinking about the Sanskrit side, where one of the rasas, one of the emotions is actually the disgusting, the horrible, the shocking, right? And I'm wondering to what extent this could be considered, or even remotely, as a kind of inoculation against trauma, right? The rehearsal of the horrible, right, or the shocking or the terrible. At a public level or at a literary level, and I don't know if that's an idea worth.
Yeah, no, I like that. I think there is, that tragedy is interested in the aesthetic effects of trauma on its audience too, right? Because it's staging these shocking moments, and I think it wants the reaction of shock from the audience as well. And I know that, they also thought of it this way, and that's where, that Aristotle passage comes in as well, that he's thinking about the staging of shock and the effects it has on the audience, as well as Plato talks about in the Ion how performances of Homer also have this effect of shock on their audiences, using the same word at Plate as well. So I think it's an aesthetic idea for the Greeks too, and I think it does, this is one of Dory's ideas as well that he's playing with, that maybe the function of tragedy in ancient Athens was to kind of form as like a form of cultural therapy, where through working through these feelings of shock as in the context of the theater, it's a way of communalizing the emotion, and so making it, one of the problems of today is this idea of isolation that makes you so maybe perhaps more affected by these moments of shock. And so he says, the communalizing of that emotion makes the purpose of tragedy was to do that, and to therefore allow veterans to reintegrate into their communities through sharing those emotions. So that's why his project's all about sharing the experience with others. So yeah, maybe that might be one. I think that it's certainly an aesthetic. They're interested in it as an aesthetic idea as well, and the effects that might have on the audience. Whether or not that's therapeutic, I think is maybe a bit more complicated, but especially because it gets into questions of like who is in the audience and for whom is it therapeutic. I don't think it was necessarily therapeutic for everyone in the audience who might have been watching these plays. But yeah, that might have been one of the intentions behind it. So much.
Well, Erika, we are over time,
Okay.
so we should, and we've made you work quite hard here. Thank you so much for that very, very rich talk, and thank you for the almost 40 people we had on Zoom as well for coming. Thanks to those of you who are here with us today.
Thank you so much, everyone.